Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first learning series webinar, Creating a Sustainable Business Model for Art Spaces. We're very excited to have our panelists and all of you here with us today, and thanks for taking the time to join us. Arts Build Ontario is a provincial arts service organization that provides small and medium-sized organizations with tools, training, and advice to manage physical and digital creative spaces successfully. ABO works to reimagine the future of creative spaces through dedicated research projects and an engaged network of supportive partners. Before we begin the discussion, ABO wishes to acknowledge the land on which we are meeting. As we come together, I would like to acknowledge that Arts Build Ontario's province-wide work takes place on the traditional and unceded territories of the Anishinaabeg, the Attawandarunk, the Petun, the Cree, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and Métis. Arts Build Ontario commits to making our programs and initiatives safe and accessible for all. And we also recognize that we are a settler organization that values respectful collaboration with all the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and who continue to be our neighbors, friends, and colleagues. In today's webinar, and alongside our panelists, we will be exploring how arts organizations can plan for their own sustainability and that of their creative spaces. A clear vision, strategic plan, and business plan all support an organization, including its space and in its short and long-term goals. We're delighted to have three leaders in the arts sector today here to talk about this and more. I'll hand things over to Tat now to introduce our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tatiana Doucette, and I'm the Program Manager at Arts Build Ontario. Welcome to our webinar, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. So first off, we have Aubrey Reeves. She is the President and CEO of Business for the Arts. Since 2020, Aubrey has been the President and CEO of Business for the Arts, a national charitable organization that shows the power of partnership between business and the arts through programs such as ArtFest and the Canadian Arts Summit, which just happened a few weeks ago in Banff. She is also a multidisciplinary artist and curator, and she possesses a unique set of sensibilities that allow her to champion initiatives encompassing the perspectives of artists, audiences, cultural organizations, and partners alike. Her artworks have been exhibited across Canada and internationally. Next, we have Alexandra Badzak, the Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Ottawa Art Gallery. Alexandra has been the Director and Chief Executive Officer for over 10 years, where she has led the charge on the gallery's expansion project, which was one of the most important cultural infrastructure projects in Ottawa for a generation, which opened in 2018. Expanding the gallery significantly, she also helped to profile the importance of Ottawa's cultural scene by creating a new progressive space for the arts and situating it on the vanguard of evolving contemporary conversations. And finally, we're joined by Gideon Arthurs, the Executive Director of Soulpepper Theatre Company and the Young Centre for the Performing Arts. From 2014 to 2022, he was the CEO of the National Theatre School of Canada, and prior to joining the National Theatre School of Canada, he led several major projects as the General Manager of Toronto's Tarragon Theatre from 2012 to 2014, and as the Executive Director of the Toronto Fringe Festival from 2008 to 2012. And with that, we'll get into the session for the day, and I'll just open it up with our first discussion question, which is, what are some of the biggest challenges currently facing arts organizations with facilities?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, I was going to say, anyone can jump in.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd be pretty confident in saying one of the big challenges that we're facing, of course, is just sort of chronic government underfunding. And that's been further sort of complicated by inflationary increases that have occurred, most especially, coming through the pandemic. And then, of course, a big issue with HR and staff precarity. I think those are some of the big thematics that I've certainly seen emerging, as well as because we're cultural anchors usually located in the downtown core of our cities. I think we also have to address the fact that many cities have declared homelessness and opioid crises in their downtown core, and so we're inevitably affected by that, whether in terms of site safety, whether real or perceived. Maybe I'll pass it on over to my colleagues.
Yeah, I'd agree, Alexandra. I think that there's, it's always hard to run a building when you're an under-resourced nonprofit. But I think that our buildings are being called upon to be more than they ever were. And where they used to be, it used to be good enough to essentially open your doors, in our case at Showtime and run a business out of that. Programming is not enough to sustain all of the social function that we fill. And certainly, what happens to our downtown cores or even our, small town cores happens to our arts venues. I remember a colleague of mine who was talking about how she had seen that there was a huge increase in cost to replace windows on a regular basis, and realized after talking to some community groups that were around the theater where she worked that it was because folks who are on meth hate to see their own reflection and would damage the windows. And so they these are things that as nonprofit folks we're not accustomed to thinking about, and certainly, in many cases we're not prepared to deal with.
Yeah, agree with everything that's been said so far. And excuse me, with the caveat of I don't have a facility of my own. Business and Arts is just a tenant in a building, but I can reflect really from what I've observed amongst our network of the Canadian Arts Summit and smaller Arts Fest organizations, and definitely agree costs are the #1 concern. The inflation has driven up the cost of heating, of insurance, of just like electricity, the very basic issues of keeping the lights on is a pressure that people are really feeling quite strongly. There's also a lot of aging facilities, and so there's the cost of maintenance and upkeep and modernization, accessibility costs. And adding to Alexandra's comment about what the facilities need to be in downtowns, they're also being expected to be drivers for tourism and an attractor for the downtown, which I think is a really wonderful place to inhabit, but there's all sorts of demands on spaces for that too. Looking across the country, there's actually a surprising number of capital campaigns for new buildings or major extensions or renovations going on across the country, which is, very commendable, but also a very challenging time to be doing that. And just a few examples of the Vancouver Art Gallery. They have finally broken ground on their project that they have been developing and fundraising for more than a decade. And so that's really exciting. It's a $350 million project. Arts Commons, they made a big announcement 2 weeks ago during the Canadian Arts Summit of an investment of $103 million from the province of Alberta. And that news came on the Friday of the summit, so it was very exciting to everyone there. But our board member, Irfan Raji, who is based in Calgary, took the opportunity to say, this is really good news for the whole sector, because if Premier Daniel Smith can make an investment like this in the arts, then all of us should be going to our own provincial governments and saying, okay, why can't you? So I take some encouragement from that. And of course, that was also a project that they have been lobbying and trying to get support on for more than a decade. There's a few smaller ones in the works too. 877 Yonge Street in Toronto is a really exciting project between Nightwood Theatre and Tapestry Opera and a housing organization called St. Clair's Housing. And then in Winnipeg, the Southern Chiefs organization is redeveloping the original Hudson Bay flagship space into an incredible multi-purpose cultural organization. So there's some really exciting capital building projects on the go.
Yeah, thank you all for your perspectives on that question, because it is such a precarious time for so many, whether or not you've got a building or you're renovating that building or building a new one. It is a very uncertain time with so many factors affecting the landscape. It's funding, human resources, operations, just inflation across the board to run your organization, let alone a space. So all those models are being affected across the board. But with this in mind, this brings us to our next question, which is, what are the key ingredients to creating a sustainable business model for an arts organization? I'm going to add with a space.
Well, I think that the biggest factor would really be diversification of your revenue. So, we're really seeing how particular sources of revenue can crumble quite quickly, unexpectedly. And if you're very dependent on, only one or two sources, that's going to make you very, very vulnerable. So as many different possible sources of funding as you can for sustaining your operations is really key. So everything from earned revenue, so rentals, merch, and cafes, and gift shops, and ticket sales for your events, and donations from major donors and small donors. Fundraising events can be quite costly, so you have to be really careful and targeted on those. But corporate sponsorship, we have seen some shifts in the past couple of years. There is definitely a trend away from the arts as corporations are refocusing on some other priority areas. But there's still some major players that are interested in supporting the arts, and then foundations and as many different public funding sources as possible, all in that mix. So maybe Alexandra and Gideon, you can think of some other things too.
I just build on, oh, I'm sorry, Alexandra, go ahead.
You please go ahead.
I just build on that, Aubrey, I think one level of consideration is diversifying your revenue sources, but I think that we have to go one step further. And that's really to redefine what our impact is as venues wherever we happen to be. And I think that the sector has to go on a journey where we move beyond the case for support around the intrinsic value of art, because art is good, to being able to demonstrate the value that we provide to the communities that we serve. And so, for example, at Soulpepper, we've got a conundrum because we have what I call a Rolls-Royce venue. It's a beautiful venue in downtown Toronto. It is disgustingly expensive to run just because of the world. And we need to find some real reason why we should be maintaining this. Otherwise, it's like a Rolls Royce that sits in the garage and goes rusty. And for us, what we've identified is that we're in a part of Toronto that is growing very, very fast, that there are people around us who work from home in 500 square foot glass boxes in the sky that have no civic space and no programming around them to create the bonds of neighborhood and civic affection that they need to feel satisfied in their lives. And so our new mission, or our adjacent mission, is to do anything we can to bring those people down to the ground floor into our space and rebuild human connection and to feel like they are part of a neighborhood and a community. And that for us means yoga classes in the morning. It means drop off classes after school. And if it happens to mean that they also buy a ticket to one of our plays, then that's amazing. But we value, I often tell the anecdote about the TTC drivers. We have a streetcar line that ends across the street from Soulpepper, and we are literally the toilet for those streetcar drivers. They come and they pee in our bathrooms, and we want to value them as much as we value somebody who's coming in to see a show in the evening. We want to say, you're welcome here. Can we interest you in something else? And we actually have started this dialogue with these TTC drivers who are really friendly and curious about what the space is. They come in and buy sandwiches and coffee now, and they engage with the installation art that we've put up in our lobby. And we've now just provided them with a TTC membership card. So any TTC person who comes in gets a little membership card, gives them a discount on our tickets, and we'll see what the uptake is. But the idea is that we are the third spaces in our neighborhoods and that we provide value. And I'll just add to what you said, Aubrey, very quickly. And I know, Alexandra, you're in the same track, but this is a values proposition, but it is also a commercial proposition. It is that if we think that our only value and the only thing that can sort of make us sustainable businesses is patronage and ticket sales, then we're cutting ourselves off from vast, vast amounts of funding, interest. We can meet so many other priorities across so many different bandwidths by opening up our spaces and making them these civic anchors. So yes, there is a values imperative, but there is also a commercial imperative.
I 100% agree with that. I think the days of our institutions being islands unto themselves we're done with that. I mean, I think the ecology that we sit within, the context, the communities that we serve, and that I just want to emphasize that we are in service to our communities, and it's not mission drift. What it is really a search and a continuation of identifying our relevance to the communities that we work within. And so, certainly in terms of sustainable business models, and I completely agree that although this sounds like a value proposition, it has its ripple effects in terms of our entrepreneurial commercial value. But it's a lot to do with our own culture. And when I use the word culture, I mean both, internal culture, what are the motivating factors? Why are people driven to be doing the work that they're doing, as well as those external aspects of your organization's organizational culture in terms of what are the values that are getting reflected back to you. And I think it's really essential that they feel authentic. That they're rooted within the community, that they're reflective of the community that you serve. And so I might also add, on top of absolutely diversifying all your revenue streams, 100% agree with that, is that continuation of being flexible, to not getting locked into old systems of operating. And we built a lot of muscle in terms of being flexible and pivoting. I know we all overuse that word during the pandemic, but quite frankly, it's pretty important that we sit comfortably with this idea that the sands are always shifting, and that we can't rest on our laurels, that we actually do need to continue to investigate where we need to be within the communities that we serve. And I think part of that for me is, and I feel very strongly about this notion of generative governance, because staff can go so far, but you really do need your board to be creating a safe space so that you can, as an organization, start to really go and explore root causes, take some risks, try out various scenarios, and basically be able to say, I don't know. Because in fact, there's a lot that we don't know in a post-pandemic environment. And so having a space where that can be explored at the governance level, I think is really, really important. And I'll end there.
I just want to piggyback on that, Alexandra, really briefly. Is two thoughts that come to mind. One of them is, I think that we forget that our community, oddly, the artistic community, is really conservative in terms of the way that it imagines how an organization runs. And we are currently in a business model, most of us, that has not existed that long, but we seem to think it's the only way that we can function. And that our purpose is, the purpose of our theater is to have a season, and it has X number of plays, and it has X number of subscriptions. These are all means to an end. What we all know is that the power of what we do is much more transformative, and we seem to be caught in a kind of binary in terms of, this is the only way that you can experience this is by getting through our paywall and sitting silently and absorbing what we're doing. And I think that we have to really question that assumption. New audiences and new communities, that is not how they think of culture and art. Certainly in a place like Toronto, and most of Canada, to be honest, but a place like Toronto, the majority of our audiences are not versed in Western forms of theater. They're versed in many other storytelling traditions. And for them, the difference between a new Canadian play and a Shakespeare and a dance show and a concert, I refer to our new audiences as polyamorous. Like, they're not just like omnivores. They are just interested in everything. And it's us who put up the silos. So just adding that in.
Yeah, no, I'd like to piggyback on that too, about the sort of, the key is really relevance and making your space relevant, as you were saying, to anybody who's coming in there. but we don't get to decide how that we are relevant. It's the audience, it's the community that decides, and they decide with their wallet and they decide with their time and whether they're going to spend money on us or spend time with us. So we have to really be way more customer centric than we really have. And that goes to those conventions that we, as a sector, we have been so artist focused and artwork focused. We have very infrequently been customer focused. And so we really need to put them first, put the customer's needs and the community's wants and values first. And we have to actually start asking them what they want and how we can serve them. And, you know, for example, we continually are talking about how the subscription model is dying. That's because it serves us. It ensures that we have a steady and predictable revenue at the start of a performance season. It doesn't meet the flexibility needs and the spontaneity decision-making that people now have in their lives. People don't plan their lives, what they're going to see on the evening of November 16th now, 9 months out. That's not what I do. It's not what any of us do anymore. So when it comes to our cultural spaces, we have to really ask them. And of course that means, you know, surveys and focus groups and roundtables. But I think it also can mean just like stopping people in your space and asking them random questions about what are they seeing, what are they hearing, you know, what are you experiencing, and how does it make you feel in this space? But also not those people who are there already. You need to be asking the people who don't go to your spaces.
Yeah.
Do they even know you exist? What are the perceived barriers to those spaces? So, you know, there could be physical barriers, but it's the attitude and assumptions about those spaces that are probably much more significant barriers to getting people in, even if they aren't true. If a misconception about your space can really keep people away.
Yeah. There's a great theater in Brussels, the KSV Theater, and they have something called a city dramaturg. And the city dramaturg's job is to go out into the adjacent neighborhoods to the theater and find out what people are thinking about. And that's that person's function. And then they bring it back to the ensemble, and the ensemble uses that to inform their creation process. I really love that model.
It's a cool little model.
Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting shift that you've all identified, that we are more than just art spaces now. We are community focused. We're thinking about audience first, sorry, being more flexible with the models that we're working within. I think that TTC example is really a great way to show that you know, we're thinking beyond what was typically what you think of when you think of an art space. We're thinking of new models to explore, which is great. This kind of leads into our next question. I was speaking with one of our mentors from our Creative Spaces Mentoring Network program, and she had identified that she didn't realize her organization was a business for the first 3 years that she was in operation. She didn't realize that she was working with, you know, numbers, finance. She was just focused on the art and what she was putting forward, but ultimately what she was doing was a business. How can arts organizations with spaces shift their thinking to be more entrepreneurial?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit, but you know, I think we should just say it. I mean, look, we run very, very complex organizations. I mean, yes, we have the need to, in our case, collect, present, and interpret you know, the art of our time and our place. But you know, we're also educators. We're also tourism destinations. We're also hubs, cultural hubs. We have sometimes acknowledged, sometimes not, soft power responsibilities in terms of advocacy around culture and in arts in the communities that we work within. Plus, you know, we're charities. Plus, we run stores and cafes and rental spaces. So let's just put it out there. I mean, we run very complex organizations, and I think we sometimes just sort of need to acknowledge, in fact, how unique that is. And I think there's interesting. So I mean, you know, the tried and true of the gift shop and membership and the cafe and the rental spaces, you know, if they're working for you, great. But quite frankly, if they're not, this is probably the time to start investigating that and letting go, and thinking about some new ways of diversifying your revenue, because let's face it, we are talking about that and the need to continue to do that. I mean, what some of the things that we're exploring right now is again looking at what we already have, and then thinking about how we can monetize that, or find a new audience for it. So, real easy example is a lot of our programming that's dedicated to youth and children, school programming, birthday parties. Flip that on over to an adult audience, and you're able to then appeal to team and corporate building workshops. And there's a big, huge desire for fun adult birthday parties. I'm just going to say there is. So like, again, just really simple things that you're already sitting on that you can just twist it a little bit, and then you gained a new audience for it. Another thing that we're looking at is investigating even our own operations. We take on mentorship and internships all the time, and we've just done it because it's important. It's about sustainability. It's about succession planning, all of those great things for our sector. But what if we name it? What if we create a program around it? Then it starts to become very attractive to a lot of corporate responsibility statements out there, and which is very interested in career transitions. So I'm thinking of the big banks. They're all exploring career and professional development as some of their key priorities for giving. So, again, it's looking at what you're already sitting on and kind of just finding a way to find some funds to come through those programs.
Yeah, I think that storytelling component around our businesses is very, very important. And on our end, I think, as in the cultural sector's end, I do think that we have to be a little bit less precious about how we package everything up. And if we don't think that we have the funds to invest in our core program or into the presentation of works, and we want to, if not, it's not a given that we want to, but if, let's say, you wanted to do more plays in a theater, then you're going to need to find alternative ways to get the resources you need to do that. And I think some of that involves actively listening to the people who can support you and then repackaging what you're already doing in ways that resonate with them. One of the amazing things that happened for us since the pandemic is we've had a longstanding relationship with the Emerging Artist Program at the Royal Bank. They fund our academy, but they give us a check. We do some training. Those people stay, within our sphere. It's a great program. I love the academy. I wouldn't change it for the world. But we started to explore what else we could do with them, and they offered us up this amazing program where they wanted their emerging leaders to have some other experience, and they basically seconded us 6 volunteers for 5 hours a week for months to do an overhaul of our data gathering approaches and do an analysis of who our audience was becoming. And that gave us such a more interesting in to RBC, and we have made allies through that. A number of those people donate now to the organization who have done the work, and it has provided us with a new angle on our case for support. We learned in that work, we already kind of knew it, but we learned in that work that we've had a huge turnover of audience. 60% of our audience is new to file since 2022, and the average age has dropped by 25 years. And this is quantifiable data now because of that partnership that I can use to go out and generate new interest and engagement with the company. So I think that repackaging is important. I will say one argument that we need to take forward, and I don't think government funding is the answer, but there was an interesting article in the Toronto Star recently about how corporations should advocate more for the arts. And I thought it was a good article, but I think that we need to talk about our sector for what it is, which is a grown-up major employer, major contributor to the economy. And the notion that you sort of kind of might throw us some breadcrumbs because we're nice to have is no longer true. And I think that when we make the case for our sector at large, we are businesses, we are employers. This sector is bigger than the forestry and the mining sector combined. We have an enormous return on investment for any money that comes into us. We basically print money out the other side because people go to restaurants and they go to the parking, and no other business does that. And if you want a battery factory, you put in $20 billion to that battery factory. But if you want a lively downtown core where people pay for parking and restaurants and the amenities that go with, then you have to put in proper investment into our businesses so that we have the runway to adapt to this new context. And that includes us being given the resources to revitalize the neighborhoods that we're in.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Gideon. And often it's about language, instead of going and asking for a donation, ask for an investment. Like, use the language of business to really reposition what you're doing. Use language of return on investment, which we do for our Arts Fest program. Our Arts Fest regional programs have 178% return on investment for our funding partners. And that simple stat really convinces people. So we have to, I guess, become less reluctant to embrace those buzzwords and business jargons that the people we're coming to with the requests are familiar with and comfortable with.
So much to take on that, right? Like that accountability that we are businesses at the end of the day. And what I was listening to all of your perspectives, we are complex spaces. So we do all those things, but we always have to be evaluating them. What is the low effort, high return for us as we are navigating these constant changes in the sands. Repackaging and listening, I think, is so valuable as well. Building on the assets that you have already. You don't need to invent something new. Let's look at the things that are going well. And using the language of business, I thought was a really good takeaway too, because it is a bit of a shift in mindset, right? We are always constantly trying to evaluate where we stand, and that is akin to other business models as well and other sectors. This brings me to the next question. And we talked about some of these, but what trends do you see and structures emerging in sustainability planning for organizations? So we talked a lot about these solutions or ideas. What's really coming forward?
I might pick up. Oh yeah, go ahead.
No,
I was going to do a big nod to you, Aubrey, in terms of the Canadian Art Summit that Gideon and myself, and obviously you helped to organize. I felt there was a real important trend and thematic that kind of came out of that, and I think that sort of represents the zeitgeist, I suppose, a bit in the sector, is really this idea that we need to work together and that collaboration is key. And that we need to be partnering, we need to stop competing and think about co-productions, think about working horizontally, because our audiences are going to be, expecting a lot from us, and it's hard for us to deliver when we just work in silos. So for me, it was already in our thinking as an organization at the Ottawa Art Gallery, but it was really great to hear that so much of arts organizations across Canada were there, and we're really excited by that particular piece.
Well, Alexandra, we were on exactly the same wavelength, because I was going to say partnerships, all sorts of different kind of partnerships. But yeah, you highlighted co-productions and touring shows and things like that, but also like on a really basic level with our spaces, sharing just physical resources, possibly even sharing human resources with other like-minded not-for-profit organizations, so you can be sharing space. an office is an office. It doesn't really have to be particularly special. And as we have all shifted into hybrid work modes, we know we need less of it. So join forces together, be able to share that photocopier and the meeting room spaces and that kind of stuff. And then you're also in a space with like-minded people that you can be, having that informal conversation around the coffee machine. And you never know what kind of impromptu partnerships bubble up out of that kind of discussion too. It's quite remarkable. But then there's also more formal ones, like I mentioned very briefly, the 877 Yonge Street. That is a really unique partnership between a housing agency. They took over a very large building that had been a long-term care space and were transforming into affordable housing. When they took over, they discovered they had this massive basement that was being not used at all. It so happens that the CEO of St. Clair's Housing is a neighbor of mine, and she knew that I was all involved with all these arts organizations. So she just asked me, would anybody be interested in this space? And I said, well, in fact, yes, because it was at exactly the same time that in the distillery district, the artscape space was closing, and that there were several organizations that were going to be homeless very soon. So connected them with Tapestry Opera and Nightwood Theatre, and they have run with it, and they are now building an entirely new performance and rehearsal space. And what's great is that it is integrating with the housing, and so there's a whole new community that they are engaged with now, and they're right on the subway line, and all sorts of positive things came out of kind of an unexpected possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with this, and we've got some interesting projects underway, but maybe I'll kind of be really brass tacks and explaining sort of what our math is right now. So I mentioned we have this wonderful venue that is incredibly costly. So here we go, cone of silence with us 104 people on this call, or 103 people on this call, but our venue just in rent alone costs us about $1.2 million a year. So I know there's a lot of other smaller venues and bigger venues on this call, but for us, that's what it costs us. So our issue has been that prior to the pandemic, we had enough sort of old-fashioned patronage that it allowed us to program at a level that filled that space adequately to cover the overhead. We could do, I think, pre-pandemic, in the best years that Soulpepper had, they had about 120,000 tickets on sale in any given year. Coming back from the pandemic, we struggled to put on enough shows to hit 50,000 tickets on sale on our own, just because of the capital, just because putting on a show was twice as expensive as it was 5 years ago. And because our donor base and our audience base was changing very, very rapidly for lots and lots of reasons. And so, we've kind of got brass tacks about it. I've said to the team this year, there's no way that we can go forward. In 2024, we have to do some trimming of our budget to stay a going concern. And we have 2 theater spaces with a total available 104 weeks of programming, right? So if you have 2 weeks, two spaces, 52 weeks each. We have a joint venture partner that uses about 25 of those, maybe 30 in a good year. So we have the remainder of that we have to use. And our 2024 season, although we're working on changing that, only had 23 weeks of programming in that balance. There's no way for us to make this venue work if we're only bringing in audiences and activity 23 weeks out of a possible 80. It is unsustainable. So for us, that notion of partnership is, again, it is values driven. We want to be connected to our artistic collaborators. But actually what we've done is we've invited 5 or 6 unvenued companies to assess what their needs are, what our capacity could offer them, both our physical plant and the infrastructure that we have in terms of being a mid to large size theater company with bookkeepers and marketing teams and email lists and all that kind of stuff. And we know that for the next 3 years, we're going to be entering into a strategic partnership with 4 of those companies so that we can ramp our programming up from 23 to 55 and eventually 70 weeks. So there are sort of really brass tacks versions of the kind of conceptual idea of we need to partner up. This is, we will bring our infrastructure and the maturity that we have as an organization, and we are so excited to encounter the creative IP, the energy, the audiences, the communities of our partner organizations. And it feels like a really equal conversation because they're bringing something that's deeply valuable for us. It's not some kind of philanthropic gesture by Soulpepper. We need them as much as they need us. So just reinforcing that partnership theme is a big one.
Yeah, it's really interesting that sometimes we come across this hesitancy to share resources or to collaborate with other organizations. We've heard that come up a few times in the past few years and just some conversations we've had in the sector. And I think that resource sharing and partnership models, new partnership models really are the way forward in that. And I think it would be good to see a lot more of that. And I think it would just benefit the sector as a whole with some of these new and innovative partnership ideas. I think we've talked a lot today about moving away from more traditional models that are reliant on membership or previous marketing techniques for ticketing and whatnot. So I think coming up with new and exciting ways is really the way forward. Moving on to our next question. We know that oftentimes a lot of arts organizations maybe don't have a large budget, or budgets get cuts and whatnot, and it's hard to keep up with costs. If hiring a consultant is outside the budget for an organization, how can they continue to grow in their strategic development?
I don't want to besmirch the entire profession of consultants, but consultants are a tool and not a solution. What we bring to the table inherently is our creativity and the fact that our businesses are based in humanity. These are things that actually often consultants find really, really difficult to work with as ingredients, and why so often outsourcing your strategic thinking to someone else doesn't work in our sector, because our KPIs and our kind of driving forces are so much outside of a frame of reference for folks who can think in sort of more traditional business models. I think that the best consultants I've ever worked with are sounding boards, are people that you can bounce ideas against, that you can bring your complicated, weird idea and have them say it back to you in a way that makes sense. And I don't think you need to pay a person to do that. I think that regardless of the scale of the organization, if you have a board, if you have community partners, if you have a parent who has been in the trenches in the things that you've worked on, I think that the sounding board is the most important. And I would really caution that very, very often we spend a lot of money on consultants to come in and tell us what to do. And if it's not generated authentically from within the company, that money is essentially flushed down the toilet and doesn't go anywhere. And there are many, many consultants whom I appreciate, but the best ones are really keen listeners. And they say, let me say that back to you, or let me challenge you on that, or let me, give you an example that reinforces your perspective. But very rarely do they say, these are the 3 things that you need to get done in order to be a successful business. And I think we can find those people outside of this kind of notion of a consultancy.
Yeah, I fully agree. I'm not a big fan of parachuting in an expert who's going to prescribe a specific strategic planning process and I'm actually not even a big fan of strategic planning processes. I mean, I think they're kind of dead. If there was anything that the pandemic really showed us, is that you can have the most beautifully written 5-year plan, and it's not worth the paper it's printed on, because the world suddenly changed. And in any kind of moment of disruption, you have to be responsive and flexible and adaptive to the conditions. And the truth is that we are now in this post-pandemic world of constant change and disruption. And so, I think you can focus on broad goals. That is very useful to have. But within those broad goals, you have to be nimble and flexible and adaptable on all of your strategies and tactics, and really have quite a business, a design thinking approach where you are, conceptualizing and prototyping, testing it out, then going back, revising, testing again, iterating, expanding that, and actually also you can think of it as really kind of a creative process. You could also frame it in terms of play and improvisation, and then letting those moments of emergent possibilities to happen. So we just don't live in a world where you can plan and then execute anymore.
Yeah, I 100% agree with both Aubrey and Gideon on this point. I do want to say, like, you've got this. I mean, we sit on so much data and expertise and experience that you really just need to dig into your organization, really bring out the voices of all the key people, all your key stakeholders, whether it's staff or board or some of your core patrons and supporters. And I would agree. I think we are in a place where long-term planning is just not our reality. So you do need to create a space where you can listen, where that's built as a process within the way that you work, and listen deeply. I think what's a general statement that we keep saying at the Ottawa Art Gallery is less is more. We actually just need to actually slow down a little bit, because the way that we, I think, need to work means that we do need to spend more time with the communities that we're working with, that we need to embed their stories, their voices, their ways of working into the way that we work. And that just sort of changes the whole dynamic. And I guess it's not to say that having consultants from time to time or some expertise from time to time doesn't make sense. But again, if budgets are tight, I think by building capital, goodwill capital, I guess, out there in the communities that you work with, you can often just draw upon those communities to help you with certain matters, whether it's an audience development question or a marketing question, or maybe you need to do a gap analysis in terms of your programs, or a bit of an environmental scan. There's lots of, I think, good will out there, and all it really takes is having conversations with your community, and you can glean so much information from that.
Thanks, guys. So listening, sounding boards, and maybe consultants, maybe not, depending. So they're a tool, which makes a ton of sense. And I think, like, Aubrey, your point about strategic plans being dead is so fascinating. Like, what a thing that we've always kind of structured around for so long, and now it's no longer actually useful, because the terrain is always changing. So, like that high level, no, I want to say pie in the sky, but ambitions for your organization, goals, long-term goals, and the short-term. I think it's just always coming back to it, right? Yeah, and listening to your digging deep to the voices in your organization, all good places to look to find that direction. I just want to note before the next question and the last question we have for our panelists, we will be moving into a question and answer period. So if you do have a question for any of us on the call, oh my gosh, on the webinar, please feel free to type it in the Q&A, and we will get to each one of them, or as many as we can, but I think we might be able to get to most of them. Okay, the last question we have for you is, what advice or first steps would you offer, or sorry, let me start again. What advice or first steps would you offer to organizations that are in that strategic and business planning process?
Well, if you're looking for a good sounding board, you should first start looking at your board. It doesn't have to be the entire board, but find one or a couple people on your board who have a mind for that long-term planning, and but they have an understanding of the culture and what you're trying to achieve as an organization, and can be that sounding board for you. What we did is we had a really fantastic board member who's very well versed in strategic planning and strategic thinking. And we, over the summer, which is our quieter time period, he and I scheduled one-on-ones with every board member and talked through just some high-level questions about where they thought the organization should be going over the next 5 years, and then together boiled that down into what we saw as kind of the vision for the next 5 years of the organization.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. This idea of going much beyond 3 years these days is, I think, really challenging. And the reason why is because we have no baseline. We have lost the baselines that we used to be able to operate on. And so any future projections, at least from a business or financial point of view, is really challenging right now. And in fact, what we've been saying and what I think brings out is that we need to be taking risks. And we need space for taking risks, and the fact that some of that might end up in failure. So as a real practical piece of advice, what I've been doing with my board in the last little few years as we've gone through the pandemic and are emerging out of it is to really kind of extrovert all of the sort of risk elements that are at play. I think very typically in maybe an older model, the CEO would just hold all of that. And sometimes we would dribble out some of that to the board or to staff, but I think it's very important now that our key stakeholders and players have a larger picture into the dynamics that are at play. So I will often present 3 financial scenarios to my board and talk through the implications of all of that, so that people can get a sense of like, okay, well, if we go really heavy on that revenue generating unit, this will happen, so that there's the greater sort of understanding of how everything will get balanced, and certainly that provides a bit of a buy-in. I guess ultimately, you hope that you can head towards consensus around that. It certainly moves you away from a win at all costs mentality, which I think has driven our arts organizations, or some of our arts organizations in the past, and that has not been healthy. So yeah, I tend to do multiple scenarios, and also I have a bit of a dashboard in terms of risks that I present to the board.
I agree so much with all of that. I'd add one other thought, which is I think that our arts organizations, I call them sort of like Frankenstein monsters, where somebody at one point like found a leg and stuck it on, and then somebody else found an arm and then an ear. And a lot of our organizations, even ones that are fairly young, started for one reason and have become an accumulation of programs and ways of doing that are deeply tied to people's personalities and previous leadership and management and so on and so forth. And I didn't intentionally do this, but as I've moved through different organizations, I've realized that my organizational design practice is that I try to think about what the essential purpose of the organization is, that I try to strip away the accumulation of programs and spare arms and spare legs. And I say, what is the main point of this organization? What is its root cause? And usually that thing is found in the archives, and it's a kind of aspirational wish that that we have as a community. The National Theatre School was a really good example. I started there. The school's already 55 years in, and everybody wanted to protect the schedule and the buildings and the programs. And I found the founding document, which was written by a bunch of people in a kitchen in 1958. And the first line of that framework was to serve the needs of Canadian theatre, blah, 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 blah. And I said, let's go back to this. In which ways are we serving the needs of Canadian theatre? Is it by having a program that is from Monday to Saturday, blah, blah, blah? Or can we actually reevaluate what the needs of Canadian theatre are today and try to serve those needs? So going into a planning process is building consensus within the organization on what that essential process is, and allowing yourself to dream beyond the spare limbs and beyond the tag-ons and beyond the programmatic incarnations of it, so that you say, this is what we're trying to get to. Do we have to get to it by doing this, by showing up at 8 o'clock and doing a play? Or could we get to that in other ways, in different sort of channels? So that would be my advice as you go into a planning exercise. What's the point? What is it that we really want to do? And do we have to do it the way we've always been doing it and the way that everybody else does it?
Alex, I don't know if you wanted to add anything, but you like nodded when
Oh,
Gideon said
Joe, absolutely.
Frankenstein.
I mean, I love the idea of again, really exploring root causes. I think that's or root visions, if you can put it that way. I think this is the time. We actually have, I think we should even think of this as an opportunity coming out of the pandemic to really get down into it and ask ourselves those hard questions. Of course, you have to have a culture within your organization that allows for that to occur. So to Aubrey's point of really sort of working with, you know, our boards and our staff to get to that place where we can have those exploratory conversations is really essential.
Yeah. It's our 50th anniversary this year, Business and Arts. Yeah, we are similarly going back to those foundational documents, etc. And it is really quite revealing and wonderful. And certainly when a lot of organizations are facing some difficult decisions about if they have to cut certain programs or staff or etc. You know, being able to return to that core and go, what is our purpose? Really helps clarify what things you can lose and still be your essential self.
All right, other Alex, I don't know if you want to jump in quickly before we go into Q&A.
I also emphatically nodded at the Frankenstein reference. So, and we are both Alex. I was like, yes, I agree with this. Yes, because our organizations have a history of being put together with so many different pieces at different times, responding to different gaps, right? So, yeah, that constant state of reincarnation or what have you. How long can I play out this metaphor? But with that, we can actually shift into the question and answer section of today's panel discussion. So there are already a few questions in the Q&A, and I think what we'll do is we'll read out each one, and then our panelists can answer each of them. And I'm actually going to start with the one from Erica. Gideon, you've answered this one, but I'm not sure if everyone can see the answers. So if you're comfortable, I'll just read it out loud. So one of the challenges that I have and see others have is not being a charitable organization, but being ready and able to apply for that level of funding. Is there discussion at the level of charitable organizations of offering fiscal sponsorship for collaborative projects?
And the answer I offered is that there's some really encouraging signs. There was a new law passed in the last budgetary cycle that will actually permit more fiscal sponsorship. So fiscal sponsorship is the idea that an organization with a charitable number will be able to process donations and issue tax receipts for a company that does not have charitable status. You know, in the case of arts companies, that's often, collectives, co-ops, very small companies. I would recommend that if anybody could possibly avoid going through that process and building the bureaucracy around it, it's very worthwhile. And that this new fiscal sponsorship rule should help with that. The rules are not 100% clear yet. They haven't issued a full opinion on how this will work, but it is evolving, and I assume within this calendar year, we'll be able to address, to be able to support smaller companies that are not charitable companies. The real difference is that there has to be a full alignment between the mission of the sponsor company and the sponsored company.
Yeah. I would also say that there's not that many funding programs that require charitable status compared to not-for-profit. You know, that you really do have to have that not-for-profit level, but there's a huge jump in responsibility and record keeping and bureaucracy between the not-for-profit and the charitable stuff. So, and I have been there, taking a startup organization through the steps of first incorporating not-for-profit and then becoming a charitable organization. And it is lengthy and costly and, difficult. So I would also say if you can avoid it, becoming a not-for-profit is actually very simple and requires, I think it's a $200 registration fee and 3 board members. So that is an easy bar to meet compared to the complexity of being a charitable organization.
Alex, you're nodding, so I think we're all you're in agreement with what has been said before. Perfect. Thanks for that question. And the next one we have is, how can artists run their own studio space and make it profitable?
Good question. I don't know.
I don't know, but there's a wonderful organization in Toronto called Artists Play, which is a dance studio and silks, acrobatic silks sort of venue. I believe that they use it for their own sort of creation processes, but they make a lot of money offering classes to young people. So my daughters take classes there. They love it. It terrifies me to watch them tangled up in silks 40 feet in the air and then dropping down. But, I think that it's sort of what we touched on earlier in the conversation is think about your assets in a more creative sense, or think about your creative assets and think about ways that people might want to access those things. Because one of the things we might forget from within the bubble of the arts is how special the work is that we do and how unusual our skill sets are. And I think if you can sit down and enumerate, okay, if we've got a space, well, we'll have space, but we'll have the artists, and we'll have, and it could be birthday parties, it could be classes, there are so many different ways to get folks who don't normally, or wouldn't come for the primary product, to come and access your organization and help you with money.
Absolutely. We also run a creative hub in partnership with the City of Kitchener called 44 Gawkel Creative Workspace. So we have a few studio spaces here and 32 tenants and run a short-term rental space. And there's so many different ways, like you said, that you can build on what you have already. So is it like temporary use of the studio that you're like a sublease, or like easy way, low-hanging fruit to capitalize on while you can still maintain your practice in the space? So we definitely have worked through with our tenants in some of those arrangements, as well as like running our own rental space. But I will say making money off of artists is not a wealthy venture, nor is it really at the core of our values. We want to make sure that these guys are sustained and supported. So that's through that partnership with the city, we're able to provide that accessible point for space. So yeah, it's definitely it's a social enterprise initiative for sure. The next question we have is, are there any resources for dance companies and schools to get help in writing a business plan? And are there organizations that are specifically geared to help fund new facilities? Ooh, okay, maybe we can answer the first one first, and then we can jump into the second part. Okay. Anyone feels compelled to go first?
I think maybe your best bet would be maybe talking to specific dance organizations. Something like Duo, the Dance Umbrella of Ontario, might be able to point you towards some useful resources for business planning.
And again, I don't think it has to be too complicated. And so I love the idea of pulling upon colleagues and fellow dance companies or arts companies, because I think there's a lot of appetite for collegial sharing. And there's no need to invent the wheel. I think there's good structure behind a lot of existing plans that can be adapted to your case.
And there's a lot of resources online too. Work and Culture has a great resource page as well for business development. So wanted to do a shout out to them. Yeah, and are there any organizations that are geared to help fund new facilities? I mean, we can help you shape them at Artsville, Ontario. So that's our mission. But in terms of funding, we are not a funder. So there are specific funding programs that will support cultural infrastructure, that being the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund, which has a rolling deadline, and the Ontario Trillium Foundation, which has a capital grant component. Some municipalities have a specific granting component to support cultural infrastructure, but those are the two ones that really our clients go to the most. And happy to share those resources at the end of this session as well. Our next question, do you think now is the time to consider going nonprofit? Oh, it sounds like, is it in style? The thing we're trying to figure out right now is whether that kind of reshaping of our structure could be a benefit to the organization in the long run. What are your thoughts?
There are lots of benefits to being a not-for-profit, but there's also definitely some downsides. So it is not the only model. You know, you can also be a for-profit business. You can be, you know, a single proprietorship. The benefit, as well as possible negative to the not-for-profit models, you do have to have a board. And those can bring you lots of resources and advice and insights and networks, but it also means you are, you know, responsible to them. You have to answer to them, and I especially think in terms of founder-led type organizations. You know, if you're a choreographer and you want to get your own dance works produced, you don't necessarily want to be answering to a committee of people about whether that is, you know, that particular vision and project is worth the risk. So I would say you have to think carefully about that. It can work if you have that team of people who believe in your vision and can support you.
There was a big rush in the early aughts in Toronto for lots and lots of companies to go out and become registered charities. And I think that the discovery that was made in that wave was that beware of over bureaucratization. And if your goal as a company is to build a sustainable long-term business, then you're going to want to identify what kind of business you are. If your goal is to explore an aesthetic that resonates with you or to serve a particular sort of emerging community need, then maybe you don't need to formalize your business structures.
Thank you. Our next question is, the problem I find from an anonymous attendee is with cutting programs is that it means you have fewer things to offer sponsors, donors, grants, etc., which means less impact, but also less wiggle room for things like staff pay and covering operational expenses. Am I wrong? Any advice?
You are not wrong. More is more. And I think that nobody has ever cut their way to success. So I think that to Alexandra's point, sort of innovation and innovation and entrepreneurial thinking and thinking big and boldly is what we need right now. And I really don't think that there's any way where you can sort of trim here, and come out the other side as a bigger, better organization.
100%. Anyone else? Any thoughts on this? Nodding. Okay. Aubrey, you're not going to say anything? No.
Well,
You're like on the fence.
Well, recognizing, you know, there are organizations in position right now where they have no choice. They do have to make.
I just cut my budget by 25%.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you don't have to sometimes cut.
You have to sometimes.
That's one thing, but decreasing what you do as a model for, you know, that I see mine as a stabilization cut, so that I can just sort of get back to basics and move forward. But you know, doing less will open less pathways to community revenue support, etc.
I guess I would maybe try and say what you're left with, those core things, invest in those to make sure that they have the greatest possible impact that they can. So that even if you do have fewer named programs or named initiatives, you can demonstrate that they have a greater reach than you did before, when you were spread very thin across many different things.
I want to pick up on that because I think I was the one who said less is more. So, so I actually do think by focusing and investing and deepening some of the core stuff that you do, you actually can then like carve out certain aspects of it that can then be tied to different donors or sponsors, because you finally had the chance to really deepen that work, and in fact probably have more time to tell the story of the impact of that work too. So I think there is something to that. And again, just another push for, you're sitting on a lot of things outside of just straight up programs, that also has an ability to connect to donors and sponsors.
Thanks, guys. The next question we have, comments are from Dimitra Christakos. Hello from Sudbury. Just a couple of comments. Our regional board volunteers still expect to see traditional business planning tools in place to support them in their governance contributions, even though that approach and language is now dated over 40 years. Thoughts from the panel?
Get some new board members.
It appears that way.
I mean, it's a real challenge, right? Of course, because we are their employee. So that power dynamic has always been a challenging one. But certainly, changing the power dynamic on the board so that there is a greater appetite to have a governance model, a generative governance model that allows for kind of new thinking at the table, is pretty critical at this point in time. Now, I appreciate that that's not always easy for a CEO or an ED to navigate. Absolutely not.
And I'd add too that sometimes it's only a matter of helping them understand what new norms are, like that it's not as big a block as one might think. So I know with my board, it took me a little moment to get used to it, but they're a board that really, really likes points of reference. So they like to have comps. They like, and if I'm going to propose something a little bit out of the box, where does this sit in terms of industry standards, competitors, et cetera. So just reaching out to some similar organizations as yours and finding out, what do you use? Let me, can I show my board what you use? And usually people say yes.
Yeah, absolutely. It didn't really mean to be good, but same. I use case studies and examples all the time to show this is what these other organizations are doing as their best practice.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's less hesitancy and risk perceived in proceeding in that direction, right? Yeah. And if you have any say in your board composition, it's always nice to mix it up too. So when you're doing that recruiting, because I don't know about everyone else here, but I do a lot of it for our organization, right? You do that outreach, and you want to bring people along. They're going to help shape that vision that you want to steer the ship in, right? Next question. Do you have suggestions on where emerging organizations can look to seek initial capital funding for the building of new spaces or leaseholds? Is there venue operating dollars from any funding organization available? Oh, that's an interesting one. I have comments on that, but I want to give it to you guys first.
Not my area of expertise. It's arts build.
Yeah, I know. I just like from your venue management point of view. Gideon, I feel like you might have something on the tip of your. No, okay.
No, go ahead.
I don't know, it's Zoom body language. It's a whole new world. But anyway, so it's always a sticking point because, and Todd, if you can keep that question there, because I want to keep looking at it and say answer. Thank you. So basically, many of the grants that we get, you cannot write off any of that revenue for rent. So that's like an ineligible expense in many cases. And so for projects anyway, I'm not sure what other grant structure or criteria is out there, but that seems to be the norm that we've come across. building of new spaces, as I mentioned earlier, is the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund. They will fund up to 50% of a project, sometimes more, depending on if your building or project is going to serve a priority area for Canadian heritage. So some of those might be like environmental, underrepresented communities is a big one too, accessibility, so and Indigenous led initiatives as well. So those are all areas that they will fund up to 90% of a project for any of those. So that's something to consider. And then pairing that again with Trillium's capital grant seems to be a great way. And you can match with in kind as well for contributions. So in some cases, if you have that in kind matching, you could in theory get the project the cash for it fully funded. So yes, we're going to put contact information for Canadian heritage or cultural spaces so you can reach out. Any other comments before we move on? No. Okay. Next question is, as was discussed earlier in the conversation, we are experiencing recruiting workforce challenges across the board to the point of owning that we are a mature and established sector. How do we strengthen the talent pipeline, particularly focusing on expanding diversity of arts and culture professionals and reinforcing that the arts can be viable and not a lifestyle of poverty?
I have a lot of
Tough
thoughts
one.
about this, but a couple different things. In terms of diversifying the workforce, first of all, I think it needs to be understood, especially in a marketplace like Toronto, but again, most of Canada these days, I think it needs to be understood as an imperative, not a kind of sort of a value statement. The workforce that we are drawing from and we are in competition for is deeply diverse, and they are going to want to work in organizations that value their perspective and experiences. And so I think we've done a really bad job in the arts sector of allowing folks who have different ways of thinking about what our organizations should be come in and contribute in ways that they find satisfying. So the first is to look internally and to really wonder whether or not you are offering satisfying experiences to people that will allow them to feel like their expressions of their cultures are honored and supported and valued. So I think that's the first, that's one first thing. I think the other thing is that HR is an emerging field in the arts. We don't have a great HR track record. We just, this year, we've just launched a shared HR manager between Young People's Theatre and Soulpepper. It's our first time having an HR department, which for any of you who know the story of Soulpepper might be surprised about. But the value of that is really creating kind of professional points of contact for incoming, outgoing, potential employees that look more like other sectors. I don't mean to sort of normalize what our offer is, but it means the recruitment process is more equitable, well thought out. It means that onboarding and performance management is no longer a kind of thing that we think of as the big banks doing. People, especially the younger workforce, want to know the parameters of their work. They want to be respected, and they want to see a path for advancement. And if everybody enters into a job where their entire job description is other duties is assigned, then it really causes a problem for them to be able to imagine what their pathway is going to be through the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, since Gideon has already sort of tackled that internal HR discussion, which I have been involved in nonstop for the past several years. We've had 100% staff turnover at our organization. I have seen that widely through the sector. But we're also very engaged in questions around the leadership pipeline. So not just getting in the next generation of the workforce, but also how do we cultivate the next generation of leaders? We were very delighted for our 50th anniversary this year to be able to launch a program called the Emerging Leadership. Both Alexandra and Gideon are advisors on that program. So what we did was invited leaders across the sector and medium-sized organizations, senior leadership roles, or senior leadership roles in larger organizations that were interested in taking on those senior leadership roles in a few years in their career to apply. We were overwhelmed by the number of applicants. I thought that was a very good sign that there in fact is a pool of people ready and excited to take on these leadership positions. And we invited them, 25 of them, to attend the Canadian Arts Summit and matched them with current leaders of Canada's largest cultural organizations. And then they're going to be meeting and talking about their leadership development through the year. We were also incredibly moved to see the response from the current leadership of Canadian Arts Summit. Everybody said an enthusiastic yes to being an advisor, which really shows also widely through the sector, people are concerned about this and want to be engaged in nurturing that next generation of leadership talent.
Yeah, so important, right? I find that we're seeing like flexibility is like really like that value is higher than monetary compensation. Time off is higher than monetary compensation. And there's new expectations generations too in breaking a colonial framework of working too. And governance are all factors that we're always looking at and seeing how they play out in different sectors too, and different with our partners as well. A comment for Victoria Steele, who is the chair of Arts Consultants Canada, who shares that a good consultant does a lot of listening and facilitation, not prescription. We know that companies have limited funds, but sometimes that third-party role can help people look at new ways of doing things by asking good questions. And I think we can all agree that is absolutely true.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next question, again from Dimitra. Hello again. Our funders haven't been enabled to really fund our work in arts education, career development, and professional development, and even as regards to our facility operations and renewal. Yeah, that's true. I shouldn't laugh, but it's also like very frustrating too. Does anyone on the panel have any comments on that front? Other than
I think it's going to change. One of the interesting things that I'm hearing from my peer group is an openness, as scary as it feels, to really start excavating, rethinking the funding structures that were sort of proposed through the Massey Commission and in a totally colonial framework. One of the most frustrating parts of talking to funders, I find in particular federal funders, but other funders as well, is a kind of narrowness in terms of, I've been saying, think outside of your core program, to rethink the way that you deliver the essential purpose of what you do. And there's very little evaluation of that in anything that you put forward as a grant to a peer-assessed arts council. And that's very problematic. But I do think that there's starting to be openness. I think that, I can say that a lot of venue companies are getting together right now and saying, we need to have a different conversation with government, just about our venues, judge us for who we are from our programming perspective and whether we're resident or not, but we have different preoccupations because we run buildings. I think that those conversations will come up. Oddly, I would suggest to us, and I don't really know if I believe this, but it looks likely that there's going to be a change of government at the federal level. And I think that the likely incoming conservative government will be very interested in reopening some of these fundamental assumptions and changing them. And we got to be careful with that because it could lead to a loss that we'll never recover from. But I do think that there's going to be an opportunity to reframe the case for things like arts education programs, social programs, venue programs that maybe wasn't open for people who are a bit more entrenched in the language of the Massey Commission.
Yeah, I think I'll just emphasize that and agree with that. I think the idea of, so the feeling that we've had of being cap in hand in the Hunger Games of the arts, we all know it needs to go. It needs to change. We need to be seen as a partner at the table. We bring service. We're service providers. And I agree, Gideon, that we go well beyond just, not just, but beyond our exceptional arts presentations and programming. And we can be having tourism conversations. We can be having a social cohesion, mental health, wellness conversations with government. Because that in fact encompasses a lot of what we do. And again, I don't believe that's mission drift. I think that is actually just representing work and spheres that we already operate in.
Indeed. And I also think, like, to the point of this thought of not investing in the professional development and training around even spaces, that's why we're here too, is to do what we can, but acknowledging that sometimes that position of being in charge of a facility, you are being asked, like, it's a tall order to know all of the ins and outs of a facility off the bat while running an arts organization. Again, going back to the complexity of our business models and our organizations. So it is a lot to take on, no doubt about it. And so, yeah, there's totally a gap in training, especially in terms of, I would say, theater as well, which is going through that, which Gideon is nodding emphatically about. Okay, we are at 2:26, so I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap up the session today. And then we will share the contact information for Arts Build Ontario, so we can pass on any questions that were not answered today or that you might have subsequently from this session, and try and answer those as best as we can. So the last question that we'll get to is from Susan Stewart. I founded hi Susan, who's been a recurring mentee in our program for many years. I founded Flick the Switch Artist Collective with over 50 artists working in 2 Queen Street West church buildings in Toronto. Recently, there is a potential eviction as one church is considering using the space instead for interns. Does anyone have any experience trying to change renters' minds about eviction? Happy to hear now or talk in more later.
I think probably, Susan, you know more than I do on this topic, but I will say that there has been a change in at the municipal government level, and there will be continued change. And I found that the new city council is really open to these conversations, and in particular in the kind of the broader context of the loss of art spaces in downtown Toronto, the closure of Artscape and many other venues which are threatened right now, means that the city is a good ally in helping to bridge some of those conversations. The other question would be, is there an opportunity to approach the landlord with a yes and proposal rather than a either or proposal? Is there, I have no idea about these programs, but is there any connectivity between them that might be interesting to explore that would allow a more dynamic use of the space?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is the precarity of not owning your building and always perpetually leasing, and unfortunately it is their property. So having looking at other partners, property partners, could be another way forward, which I know is not the ideal situation. No one likes to move, but it seems to be that a lot of arts organizations in Toronto are on the move, hopping around to each location where they can find one, and finding that partner, that property owner who's going to see the value in the arts. So it's, yeah, a lot of partnership development in that regard. All right, well, I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. I thought we could, but here we are, and what a rich discussion it's been over the last hour and a half. I'm going to hand things over to Tat to wrap up, but thank you all for your contributions. It's been a really, really interesting conversation about this really timely topic of sustainability in art spaces.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for the call for today and sharing your insights on all these great questions. I think I'm going to send everyone in the call today our little slide deck that has all of ABO's resources after the call, just being mindful of time. But I will flag that we have a few different resources that I think would be beneficial to a lot of folks in the room today. We offer a program called Asset Planner for the Arts, as well as Planet Build It, both really great tools for looking at your facilities and long-term planning. But again, I'll send that to the group after so that you can learn about it in more detail. I also want to invite everyone on the call today to join us for our next session in the learning series on May 2nd. And this will be on hub culture and sustainable spaces for the future. So we'll be looking at the concept of arts hubs and how shared space models have emerged as a cost-effective and sustainable solution. You can register through this on our website or on our Eventbrite page. But that brings us to the end of the webinar for today. Thank you so much to the panelists for the wonderful discussion, and thank you to the group for attending and for your thoughtful questions and participation. If you have any further questions, like we said, we'll be sharing our contact information, and reach out to either myself or Alex if anything comes up between now and later. But thank you. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.